Excellent. Right. Hopefully you can all see that. Fantastic to see participants here. Looks like we've got about 50 people so far, and no doubt there'll be a few more coming in as well. In fact, I see there's even some more coming in right now as we go. So I'll let them all in as well. I see a few more familiar names in the mix there. So thanks a lot for coming along today to talk about speed management, which I know is of great interest around the country and indeed around the world in terms of how we're slowly getting better into this space in New Zealand and starting to appreciate the benefits of it. And this is really what I want to cover today is the range of benefits and then how we can start thinking about how we implement some of this as well. So just a few webinar guidelines here. Hopefully the system should be that you'll see the screen in front of you and you'll be able to hear me, but you won't be able to share your video or audio, and really not much point. What we want to do is use the chat function if you have any questions that you want to ask as well. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to find there's a chat button there, and pull up a box off the side. You can ask questions. You can either just ask them to everyone, or if there's maybe a technical question or something, perhaps your audio is not working or something, you can also have a direct question to the Strata as well. Okay, and we'll have a look at those towards the end in particular. But you know, feel free also if you want to add any contributions to the discussions along the way. I often find these meetings, there's some really good contributions from others who've joined in as well, and if you've got some useful input, then feel free to throw it into the mix there as we're going along as well. Hopefully it doesn't distract you too much from the presentation. As we said, we will make a recording of this session, and we'll provide the link through all our usual channels afterwards as well. Okay. One more join the room, so good to see most people on time. Excellent. So what I want to do today is really not spend too much time talking. I want to sort of briefly introduce some of the benefits of speed management. We'll talk about the safety benefits first because they're clearly quite an important part of it. But I do also want to highlight some of the non-safety benefits, because I think it's important for us to appreciate that there are a lot of spin-offs as well from particularly reducing speeds, and it's not just the safety benefits, and we often don't appreciate those, or we don't sell them terribly well. So I think we've got to look at that as well. And then I'll touch on some aspects of how we can implement speed management in your area as well. Give you a few ideas there. Hopefully that'll be about half an hour, and I really want to open up the opportunity for having some discussion and questions as well, because I'm sure you've all got some different issues in your areas, or some things that I may have not covered in detail that you may want to perhaps get some expansion on as well. So I guess the first thing to remind ourselves is that even small travel speed changes can make quite a difference. Okay, and this is research that we've seen around the world, and we're certainly starting to see the same evidence here as well, is that you can have even little percentage changes, and they can have quite a big impact on the relative severity and likelihood of crashes. So, for example, typically this is work from Goran Nilsson, going back a while now, but he's done some follow-up stuff, and it keeps coming through as being very consistent, that for every 1% speed reduction, you tend to see a 2% change in all injuries, about a 3% change in serious injuries, and about a 4% change in the fatality. So you can see how it really starts making a difference as you get those more serious impact ones there. So even if you're shuffling your speed management even by a few kilometers, that can actually have quite a big difference to your bottom line. We've got lots of overseas evidence of this. One of the ones I refer to a lot is the ITF, International Transport Forum, who did some really good work on this a few years ago, looking at some of the evidence around the world. But we're also starting to build up a lot of good evidence here in New Zealand as well. So just as an example, these are some of the ones that I've come across in recent years as well. I've done some of the case studies for some of these ones, urban ones, rural ones. Some of these we're slowly turning into information that we can make available for everyone. So I've been working with Waka Kotahi recently to help develop a few case studies for some of these. And this is really so that we can have some useful background information for you if you're looking to implement something similar in your area, you can say, well, so-and-so tried it and this is what they found as well. So look out for that in the near future. There's going to be quite a number of these safe systems, safer journeys, case studies for different types of treatments, including speed management. So they will hopefully help you understand what are the potential benefits that you can get. I know in the sort of the social media commentary about reduction of speeds in particular, people keep coming back to the issues of saying, well, it's not the speed limits, it's the drivers. We've just got to make drivers better, and it's all those bad roads, and we've just got to spend a bit of money on roads as well. And I think we've got to have a bit of a reality check on both of these fronts. Yes, we've definitely got to keep, pushing hard on driver education enforcement. We've got to keep spending money in the right areas as well. But we've got to keep reminding ourselves we're human, and until those autonomous cars show up, and I don't think it's going to be anytime soon, and even if they do, we do make mistakes, we make poor decisions. I don't think any of us could claim we haven't had some situation when we thought, whoops, my bad, didn't quite get that right, despite the best of intentions. And that's really the issue. As much as you can try to be a good driver or good road user, try and be law-abiding, there's still the likelihood that there'll be some situation that you get it wrong. You didn't see something, you made a bad call, and possibly the consequences could be bad as a result. And there's been some really interesting research overseas that's actually looked at this and said even if road users followed all the road rules, there's still a lot of crashes that happen because of these sort of mistakes and poor decisions as well. And you'd still probably have about half of the fatalities still kicking around. In fact, you wouldn't even probably reduce the injuries by as much in that situation. So that's something to bear in mind, is that what we're trying to do with speed management is partly compensate for that human frailty that we have, that we can't always get it right. The other thing is to consider the fact that we've got about 90,000 kilometres of roads in New Zealand, and they range from obviously high-end motorways to sort of dirt tracks in the middle of nowhere, basically. And there is no way we could even afford to fix every single one of those up to a standard that would allow higher standard speeds all the way through. In fact, really only a small proportion would ever justify that on the traffic volumes alone. So we've got to be quite realistic about which ones we do spend our money and say, okay, yes, this does need to actually improve, median barriers and improved intersections and so forth, and which ones we say this is not going to happen anytime soon. We've got to minimize the risks of what happens when we do have crashes, and speed management is a big part of that. Okay, and I think the thing to keep reminding ourselves is the fact that it's really about the consequences. This is where speed kicks in. It does affect the likelihood as well. It can obviously help with the reaction times for those, but it's really about the consequences. And you've probably seen charts like this of various forms over the years. And basically they look at, for the different speeds down the bottom there, the impact speeds, what is the likelihood that you're going to end up as a fatality or a serious injury from there. And it depends on the type of crash. Things like head-on crashes, for example, cars are fairly well designed to protect you from those at quite high speeds. Side-on, not so much. Impacts with pedestrians and other vulnerable road users, even less so again. So you can see these sort of classic S-shaped curves that you come up with, that at low speeds, yep, there's a fair chance you're going to walk away from it, but as the speeds go up, there's a much greater chance that you're not going to, or you're going to be very seriously injured as a result. And that's really the key, and especially the bits where these graphs jump up very quickly. Okay, so you look at that pedestrian fatality risk one, for example, and anything over 50 Ks, it starts getting up there, and by the time you're getting close to highway speeds, you're doing very well to walk away from if a vehicle hits you at those speeds. So these have quite big impacts on what happens in a crash. Okay, it's not so much about the crash, it's about what happens during the crash. So people often talk about how do we reduce crashes, and that's an important question to have, and there's some definite things we've got to look at. But in this case, we're really interested in what happens to the fatalities and the serious injuries within those crashes. And sometimes you may still have the crash, but the beauty is that you'll hopefully have much reduced injuries as a result. And that's really, again, what speed management's about. People keep coming back to travel times as being one of the biggest concerns. If you're going to reduce speeds, it's basic physics. That's surely going to mean you're going to travel, take longer to travel, and it's this efficiency versus safety trade-off that often comes into conversation there. And I think we've got to sort of reframe that a little bit in terms of what we're asking. So yes, it's true. You will get some change if you slow down, but we've got to be mindful of what actually mostly delays traffic. And I could spend a whole presentation on this area alone, but basically, if you think about it, most of the time you can't actually travel at the maximum theoretical speeds. Other things slow you down. Other traffic slows you down. Towns, intersections, other point restrictions as well. Every time you have to slow down for a curve, come up to an intersection, you have to stop for a second. There's roadworks. All those things actually add up to quite a lot of time when you're not going anywhere near the maximum speed. And it's actually those slower times that have a much bigger effect on your overall travel times than your faster times as well. Okay, so that's an important thing to bear in mind. The other thing, though, is in terms of how we determine the benefits of speed management. And travel time's one that people often focus on. How do we get from A to B quickly? But actually, there's a lot of other economic benefits as well. Okay, we've already talked about the safety benefits of reduced speeds. But we're also starting to recognise some of the other ones as well. Things like health benefits of the spin-offs of actually having a nicer environment and getting more people walking and cycling, for example. The retail benefits of a place that people actually want to stop and hang around and spend some money as well. And the property benefits as well. If you actually live on a street that actually is nicer because people aren't zooming through it as well. All these things are economic benefits that do matter to people as much as necessarily getting from A to B. So I think we've perhaps got to reframe the question, and it's not, are we trading off efficiency versus safety? I'd say what we're doing is we're trading off a little less mobility for actually a lot of improved amenity in a lot of cases here. Okay, and if we start thinking of those other benefits and framing it to the stakeholders that we're talking to, then I think people can appreciate that more. I just want to introduce some of those potential benefits, some of the research that we've come across, some I've been involved with actually. So this is one a few years ago that one of my master's students looked at. We looked at a couple of residential streets, and one had been traffic calmed and one was sort of a more conventional street. And we asked the residents and the people walking there some questions about what they would do and how likely the nature of the street would influence them. And this is an interesting question here about looking at residents' decisions to let their child walk alone on the street. And a lot of residents, of course, have concerns about child safety, strange danger, that kind of thing. But also when we looked at the issues of traffic speed, that was also a very important influence on their decisions as to whether they would let the child walk on that street or not. So bear that in mind. If you want to get more independence for young people around, then having environments that their parents feel comfortable in letting them go is quite an important one as well. This was some interesting stuff I saw over in Germany. I saw the sign on the right, and initially I wasn't quite sure what it was about. And I realized it was a 30-kilometre speed limit, but only at night time. It's between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. And the German word there is noise prevention. So basically the reason they had this lower speed limit was to reduce the noise overnight when presumably people are trying to sleep. So that's potentially a benefit, not just necessarily for nighttime. You could, of course, make the same argument throughout the day. And on the left there is and another example from Germany, one of their freeways there, and they have some where they have reduced speed limits because of sensitive ecological areas. So if you're near some kind of sensitive bird life or something like that, who doesn't really appreciate having lots of loud trucks going past them, this is another reason why they might slow down the speeds as well. Another example that we saw not that long ago in Europe was in Netherlands, where they were having to think about how they met their climate change requirements. And they realized that they were going to struggle to do that. And when they looked at how they could do it, one of the best ways they realized they could do it very quickly was to actually reduce their open road speed limits on some of their major highways as well. And you can see the politics. They will say, oh, yes, well, we're not very happy about this, blah, blah, blah. But it's interesting that they sort of identified that as one of the ways they could meet their emissions targets just by reducing those top-end speeds. Okay, so that's sort of some of the benefits, and you might think of others as well. Happy to have some more discussion about that later on as we're going through. And now I just want to have a bit of a chat about how we might go about sort of doing some of the options for speed management. And when you think about your networks, it boils down to these are your options really, okay? With the existing network, in terms of the speed limits, you can either increase, decrease, or not change at all your speed limits, or possibly introduce variable speed limits. And there's different ways that you might do that. So in looking at your network, there might be areas where actually you don't need to do anything to the existing road environment. They're what we call self-explaining. Okay, you look and say, well, that already feels like a 60 or an 80 or a 40 or what have you. And really the environment is already set up for it. You just need to put in the appropriate speed limit for that situation. Okay, so that we've often got a lot of existing self-explaining roads. They're self-explaining for the speed limit that they should be, not necessarily the same one. Sometimes you will go up or down, but sometimes the one that's there is perfectly fine as it is. The other option often is talking about engineering up. If we say, well, we actually do want to have a faster speed limit, but the road's not really set up for it at the moment, we're going to have to do a bit of work. We're going to have to improve it, maybe put in some treatments like upgrading intersections, barriers, things like that, so that maybe we can have those particularly higher speeds roads as well. Okay, so if we're looking to increase the speed limit or keep it the same, we've got to think about our options for how we might engineer up to achieve that. Our third option, which doesn't always get talked about, is the concept of engineering down as well. So measures where you're actually going to make it feel like it should be a slower road, and maybe things like traffic calming would be one example of that. Sometimes that's just to keep the speed limit the same and actually be a safer environment at that speed. Sometimes though we're wanting to do that though because we want to introduce a lower speed limit for other reasons, some of those amenity reasons that I just talked about, for example, and we may have to work a bit harder to make those actually achievable as well. So we have to think about how sometimes we may have to invest in engineering down as well as engineering up, and which ones we actually can just look at changing the posted speed limit and that will suffice. One of the tools that we use here in New Zealand now for the last few years is Mega Maps, or its more formal title down the bottom there. And this is definitely a very good starting point for how we can look and think, well, how does our network stack up? There's a lot of really good data in Mega Maps, gives you all the background about the existing network, its existing speed limits, and then it has various risk assessment calculations there that can help you make a bit of an informed decision. This one here is probably one of the key ones. This is what we call the safe and appropriate speeds. You can see the calculated ones on the left-hand side there. Now, pretty much all this network that you see in front of you, this is from South Dunedin, is at the moment 50 k's, apart from the state highway running through the top there. But you can see that actually when you look at what are the calculated safe and appropriate speeds, there's a lot more sea of blue, you know, away from some of the arterial roads. Most of those local streets are saying, actually, these probably should be 40s. And you can even see some bits where they're saying maybe this should even be 30 as well. And that's pretty much the same I find throughout the country, is that in the urban areas, a lot of the network is saying it should be at least down to 40. And in rural areas, often saying it should be at least down to 80 as well. We have a lot of roads mismatched to the current speed limits. You can see the green dots there on this particular map. That's actually showing where the schools are in this area as well. So that's another key reason why they really want to seriously look at this. And this is some work that we did recently for Dunedin City, was actually considering what was the best approach for speed management in this area. So using this information and really considering in things like those schools, and also where the orange areas, that's a bit of a shopping area as well. There was actually a potential to even go lower than these as well. So we are considering options where we'd actually introduce a lot more 30-kilometre zones as part of this as well. But that's part of the conversation you can have. Mega Maps gives you that really good starting point at least, and then you can do a bit of a sense check. You have to remember that a lot of Mega Maps, the calculations are based on those safety calculations, sort of tied in with the land use, the function calculations. They don't always capture all the other bits of information that you might be aware of as well that you have to take into consideration, like the presence of schools or commercial areas or some other strategies that you might have for doing certain things in your areas. But there's a lot of good value to start with there, and then you just need to work through the reality check of, okay, what can you do and what makes the most sense? And I always suggest that the first thing to do is start with what I call the low-hanging fruit. And this is really the stuff that's pretty easy to do because it's that self-explaining stuff. Okay, it's the stuff that when you look at the streets, you say, yeah, that actually makes sense. And in the urban areas, we've got a lot of situations, for example, commercial streets, residential streets, where the environment is already screaming out to say this should be 40, this should be 30. And so we might as well reinforce that. And they're easy ones to do. School zones as well, often a relatively easy sell. I think anything where it's do it for the kids is often a lot easier to make that case as well. So that's quite a good one there. In rural areas, we've got a lot of roads that have relatively low standards. They're unsealed, they're winding, they're narrow. And so again, it's often pretty easy to make the case to say this actually shouldn't be 100. This should be something less, 80, maybe even less than that as well. So I think it's always worth looking at your network and identifying, well, what are the easy ones? What are the easy wins that we can say, this really, we shouldn't have too much argument with this. And the beauty of that is that you can get some things off the ground quickly, but then you've also got some stuff you can monitor and build up some evidence for perhaps the trickier ones that you've got to come back and have a bit more of a conversation about. Some people will say, well, okay, all you've done is change the posted speed limit there. How's that going to make any difference? How's that going to change people's behaviour? But what you find is it does do it. And a lot of evidence around the world, and I've seen similar evidence in New Zealand as well, is that as a rough rule of thumb, for every 10 kilometres that you change a posted speed limit, you tend to find about a 2 to 3 kilometre an hour change in the mean speeds. So if you change 20 k's, you might get about a 5 kilometre change in those mean speeds. And the reason behind it is really because when we're looking at roads as drivers, we sort of have two different things that we're considering. We have the road environment itself. How wide is it? How straight is it? What's alongside it? All those kind of things. And that has a big impact. But then we take into account a little bit the speed limit as well. Now, there is a caveat here. We have to be aware what that speed limit is. So we have to work hard to make sure that people are aware what speed limit they're going into. But yeah, you tend to find it's a bit of a mix, that they do place quite a lot of weight on what the road environment is. So you can look to change things there. But they change a little bit due to the speed limit, thinking, oh, I shouldn't be going that fast. I should slow down a bit. And that may be enough sometimes. That may be all you're needing, is just looking for a couple of K's difference to shave off the speeds as well. If it's not enough, then you've got to start looking at what else you can do to the streets. What kind of physical treatments can you do? Now, here's an example of a street near where I used to live, actually. And as you can see, it's a classic Christchurch wide, straight racetrack, really. And this is a local street. Probably explains why the kid on the left-hand side has decided to cycle on the footpath rather than down the road. But it gives you a nice basis for, well, what could we do to actually turn this into a much better residential local street? And there's a number of different key concepts. The first one is just playing with the width. Clearly something that wide makes you feel like it's open and you can sort of put the foot down. So anything you can do to narrow up the alignment certainly is going to help. We can potentially play with surfaces as well. We can think about things like rumble strip surfaces or humps and bumps and things like that as well, that add a bit of discomfort, I guess, to the surface that you're driving on. And we can also play with sight distance as well. So rather than being able to see all the way down this long street, suddenly I can't do that. Suddenly I've got things in my way, whether it's vegetation or something else, that breaks up those sight lines and means I'm not quite sure what's around the next corner and the next corner. So that's sort of some of the types of treatments that you can do to try and manage the speeds. And some of these can be relatively low-cost treatments, things that you can do with a few paint lines and posts. Other things might have to do a few plantings or full-on street reconstructions. And it's really up to your budget as to what reasonably you can do in the short term. We're obviously seeing a lot of tactical urbanism projects at the moment, which is really great to see. And some of those can have some of these desired effects. Some of them, though, at some point, for example, this street here, the council may have to come back and just completely reconstruct it as a much more local-looking street. I think another important thing, too, is to make it clear to people why you are reducing those speeds. And, of course, we can just put up a basic speed roundel, but I really like it when we actually sort of embellish it with some details about what's going on. So the fact that we're going into a shopping area or a school zone or a high crash area, things like that. I quite like a couple of these ones I threw in from Australia as well. Again, they illustrate the same point. High pedestrian activity. That's a pretty good reason to want to slow down as well. So I think as much as possible, we do want people to sort of understand and go, oh, okay, that makes sense. That's fair enough. Rather than just putting in the basic speed sign with nothing else. So there's a number of steps that you've probably got to work your way through if you're going to develop a speed management plan for your area. And this slightly long list just gives you an example of the kind of processes that you do have to go through. And I have talked to some of you in the past about these kinds of things and how we can possibly help you with this. It really is a case of starting from that data that Waka Kotahi has, but also your own local data and information, and then starting to develop a strategy for those. And you will have those different options as to whether you are changing speed limits, whether you have to do any physical works. Then you'll, of course, have to work out which ones you do first, which ones can wait later. That'll feed into your plans. All of this information and rationale you're going to have to present to your council, to your public, take on board the feedback from them as well, and ultimately make it happen as well. So that's a very short version of what needs to be done. And there's a lot of nuances to it, and we know there can be a bit of politics and technical challenges as well. But just making a start, identifying the quick wins, as I say, may be a good way to at least get some runs on the board as well. Okay. An interesting thing we're starting to see some conversation about is the potential rollout of region-wide speed plans as well. So this is something that may show up in legislation here in coming months, hopefully, where the concept will be that each regional land transport area will have to develop a regional speed management plan and hook in with their respective local authorities. And Waikato has already sort of taken the lead on that one by working on that in the last couple of years. The likes of Auckland, which is a unitary authority, has also been making good gains as well. I know I've had some conversations in Canterbury about trying to come up with something similar there as well. It may be in the not too distant future that it's actually a requirement of every region to develop something like this and to try and develop these consistent approaches. And I think it's going to have economies of scale advantages too, particularly for some of our smaller councils that will struggle to have the resources to perhaps develop some of this themselves too easily. They can hopefully hook into a more consistent region-wide approach as well. So I'll be interested to see how that plays out. Okay, well, I'm actually running to time, which is amazing for me. So I want to leave it there for now so that we do have lots of time for the questions and discussions coming through. So at which point I should actually open up the chat so I can actually see what it's looking like and what questions we've got. Perhaps I'll stop sharing the screen for now, and if anything comes up from that, we can go back to that. So let's have a look and see. Yes, I should have commented actually, and I forgot to mention that initial cover slide featured one of Christchurch's special neighbourhood greenway signs, which I quite like, but I should point out the technicality that it actually hasn't been formally approved yet. So yeah, it's a good example though of that. You know, how do we explain why we're doing a lower speed, and whether it's by words or by graphics, we've got to look for options for that. But yes, there is a process for how we introduce new signs, and we certainly should be looking to try and follow those as we go through. Okay, let's just have a look. There's a question about, are there any of these New Zealand case studies published and where can we find them? So two-part answer. The first one is that we have done some of these case studies ourselves here at Via Strata, for example, for Christchurch, for Mount Maunganui. We did one for Hastings rural areas recently as well. And so some of those, you can go to the Via Strata website and you can find links to those. In fact, if you just go to our website /speed, you'll get to our speed management page, and that's got a link to some of the various resources there, some of the case studies, some of my past papers as well. As I mentioned, what we're looking to do is also help Waka Kotahi, New Zealand Transport Agency, to also develop some of these case studies as well. So some of these, like Christchurch CBD, in that we've turned into a template for a case study that will end up on their website, And so soon you'll be able to have resources that you can access from there. So it'll give the details about, well, what happened, what were the findings, what were the safety outcomes, who to contact for more information, all that kind of stuff. All right, so watch out for those. In the meantime, you're welcome to certainly talk to us about any of the case studies that we already have in our system. Right. Next question is, have you developed specific consultation strategies or tips? One of the papers that I did a couple of years ago was looking at trying to address some of these, I guess, myths or misunderstandings of speed management. And I've addressed some of them here in the presentation today. The issues about, fix the drivers instead of the roads, or it's going to make everyone slow down by 20% or things like that. So that's one of the things, is to identify those common hot points that do keep coming up. I mean, you've only got to look at the social media every time there's a speed management discussion, and sort of look at the common concerns. Okay, and there's some validity behind some of the issues that are there. So you've got to identify what is the real concern versus what is a bit that's perhaps blown out of proportion a bit as well. But yeah, so we've certainly identified some of those and developed some of these, and I know Waka Kotahi's taken some of them and used them for their resources as well. So if you go to the speed management section of Waka Kotahi's site, you'll see some sections there that have some of these questions, or frequently asked questions, that come up as well. Some of that based on stuff we've done as well. Some councils have done that as well. I remember Auckland Council produced some similar stuff when they were doing their initial speed management as well. I personally think it's a bit of a waste of resources if everyone's developing their own ones. I think it makes a lot more sense that we try and have a common set that everyone's getting the same message as well. And I think come back to some of those wider aims as well. So yes, safety is a key reason why we develop some of these things, and that is going to continue to be a really important reason for why it's happening, and how you're going to justify it too in terms of funding. But I think looking at some of those other benefits, and perhaps identifying with your stakeholders as well, and saying, well, what's important to you? And if for example, it's important that your family can safely walk around the area, for example, that your kids don't have problems running across the road, or getting across the road without getting run over. If you can identify those hot points, then you might be able to say, well, okay, this is one way we can help with that. If businesses are concerned about impacts on economy there, you could say, well, actually, potentially, if you're getting more people walking in this area, you often find that there's actually a gain. And we look at where are some of the best economic areas in New Zealand and the world, and it's often those places that actually there's not much traffic. They're shared zones, or there's no traffic at all. So we can look for examples to help them understand that, but it's tricky with change. And so as much as we can use examples, that's good. The other thing is, over time, is using your own evidence as well. So if you started with some of the easy wins, and in a year or two, it doesn't take long often to be able to show the difference in certainly the safety effects, and be able to say, look, we're already seeing this drop in the number of fatalities and things like that. And so that evidence can then be used to build for the next ones and for the next ones. And I see we're already seeing that, for example, some of the speed management up in the Nelson area there, State Highway 60, and they've had a dramatic reduction in fatals and serious injuries since they introduced the speed limits, not even 2 years ago, I think now. That's the kind of evidence you need to then be able to say, now we want to consider this next one, and we're going to see the same benefits with any luck. Right, what else have we got? If we implement 30-kilometre speeds outside schools, do we need to install physical features to keep the speeds down? I think politically there's a push to not necessarily require that, but for now at least, it does make sense, I think, to look at what else you can do to help with that. School zones kind of work better than some other 30k zones, as I say, because there's an element of do it for the kids that I think compliance is often a bit better in 30k zones than you sometimes see with some other zones, because people understand a bit more the reason for it. So that helps, and there's a lot of activity going on. Certainly at the school time zones, there's obviously lots of kids and cars and things. So it does make it a bit easier, but I think it's worth still exploring whether it'd be worth putting in at least some kind of treatments to help back that up if you can, and it might be simple low-cost stuff. The other way to do it is to do a bit of a check and see approach. So it might be putting in the lower speed limit now, seeing what kind of speed change you're getting. If you're not comfortable with it, then having that backup option of saying, okay, we actually need to put in something. I think the concern is when we do it the other way around, where we almost say we can't put in a 30k school speed zone until we have the street dialed down completely. And that sometimes means it goes nowhere because you don't have the funding available at the time. So sometimes I suspect it's better to work the other way and say, well, let's try it, and we think it might get us part of the way there, and if it's not enough, we'll consider whether we've got to do a bit more work and have some budget down the line to look at that, or even temporary stuff to try and get things started. It's clearly going to be quite a hot topic over the next few years. We're seeing a lot of government push to make 30k speed limits happen a lot more. Part of that legislation I was just talking about before for the regional speed management plans, another strand of that has been talking about trying to make pretty much all schools have some kind of school speed zone in the near future. And I know on state highways it's pretty much becoming policy now that they have to look at the options for a school speed zone now on any schools they're passing. Okay. The question about what are the thoughts about certain time periods for speed limits, like the German example. I guess we're seeing that with the variable speed limits for school zones already. So we have the legal ability to do it. And the question is whether you've got the right reason for being able to do it. At the moment, the setting speed limits for all, if I recall, has only certain criteria that allow you for when you can introduce a change in time periods. And off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact wording of it, but I guess you've got to look to see whether your situation would meet that criteria to be able to introduce a variable speed limit for a certain time. Could be, for example, you've got a street that at night time becomes a bit of a party street. There's lots of bars and things, and so you want to have a lower speed limit then, but perhaps during the day it's not the same situation. So if you could find a case to say, okay, there's a reason why we want to do that, that could be an example there, for example. I think it's variable speed limits is something that we probably haven't used as much as we could, and partly because it's a cost element. Those variable speed signs definitely cost a lot more than your average signpost for a speed limit. But they have potential to perhaps solve some of the trickier ones where we're saying this speed limit doesn't feel quite appropriate 24 hours of the day as well. And so I suspect we probably should look for more situations where they could come in handy. We're seeing them very usefully employed for the rural intersection warning signs at the moment. When the traffic comes on the side roads, the speed limit drops down to usually something like 70, and there's been some really impressive safety gains as a result of that. And people kind of understand that one. Okay, there's a possible risk here, that's why I'm slowing down. If there's no cars, that risk isn't necessarily there. Okay, I see Malou has put in a link to our speed management page there in the chat as well. So if you wanted to have a look at that and see some of the papers and other material that we produced there, and happy to have any follow-up questions on that as well. Okay, there's a comment from Janine from Waka Kotahi saying that Waka Kotahi is keen to work with local councils where possible to do joint consultation on speed management, noting that many people don't differentiate between state highways and local roads. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because you kind of have to have a coherent network, and it's something we've been involved with a few state highways speed management reviews in the last year or so. And one of the things we do as part of that is actually look at the surrounding network and think, well, hang on, if we reduce the speed limit on the state highway, is someone going to use the local road instead? Is someone going to take a shortcut because they perceive it as now quicker instead? And so that's one of the things you've got to look at is, what are those opportunities? And maybe that means you've got to have the conversation with the local authority at the same time and try and get some coordination going on. And I think it makes a lot more sense then too, that people understand why a whole area is being done rather than isolated one-off roads as well. One of the problems with mega maps, if you look at sort of what are the top 10% or top 20% roads for introducing speed management, is that they are a bit scattergun. You know, they're very much driven by safety, and often that means they're driven by the busiest roads or the ones with the most crashes. And so it can mean, if you look at them, that they are all over the map a bit. And if you just introduce those, you can understand people going, well, you just reduced that speed limit. Why didn't you also reduce that one as well? And, you know, that's the same kind of road. Why didn't you introduce that? And you can understand why it wouldn't seem very legible for people if you're doing that. So I'm a big fan of looking wider than the roads that are in that top 10% and coming up with a bit of a 10% plus plan and saying, well, while we're doing those two roads, we're also going to look at these surrounding ones because that one's the same. So we should do that as well. And that one needs to be this to be consistent, et cetera, et cetera. So trying to come up with a coherent plan for an area, I think, is a much easier sell than sort of a bit of a scattergun saying, well, we're doing this road, and this road, simply because they're at the top of the list from safety. Okay, and definitely that coordination between the state highways and local roads is a good part. I'm hoping that with the development of regional speed management plans, we'll see a lot more of that happening too as well. That conversation will have to happen anyway. I've seen some really good work in Waikato where they've done that, had the conversations about, well, here's the agency's plan for their state highways. How does that tie in with what you're looking to do for your local authorities as well? And that's the kind of conversations that will make a lot more sense and resonate with all the stakeholders. Okay, boy, there's a lot of good questions here. So I know clearly we're not going to get to them all, I'm afraid. If we don't, I'll just say we might try and follow up with sort of a follow-up text or statements about some of the ones we don't capture later on. Okay, what about roads with very different traffic volumes and compositions at different times of day? For example, Marston Road here in Christchurch, the new 60 is appropriate at peak and daytime periods, but compliance at night time is low and causes frustration. Yeah, it's a tricky one, that one, as to whether a variable speed limit is one option, but not entirely sold on that, or whether it's one where we've got to think about, can we do something about the street treatments? So whether a few playing with things like road markings and so forth could possibly help reinforce things a little bit more at night time. Or you've almost got to have a pragmatic question about, does it matter too much? If your peak concern is those peak daytime periods, if that's where most of your crashes are, then it might be that you're addressing that problem, and maybe you could almost let it slide if the fact that it feels like compliance isn't as good at night time. I think one thing we're going to be mindful of is not getting too hung up on actual compliance. I'm more interested in the question as to whether traffic speeds have slowed down, because that's the thing that gets us the safety gains. And so maybe even at night time, the compliance isn't great, but the mean speeds have still gone down by 5 k's an hour, for example. That's a gain. That's a win in my book. Even if you say, but the proportion who don't comply is high. I'm less concerned about that. I mean, if you want to, you can look to try and make roads more self-explaining with engineering treatments to help with that. But I think the ultimate aim of the game is, have we got traffic traveling at a safer speed and getting the safety outcomes as a result? And that should be your number one metric, not necessarily how many people are complying with the new limit. In fact, there's a very likely chance if you reduce the speed limit, your percent who comply will actually go down, okay? But the mean speeds will also come down as well, and that's the more important metric. But yeah, that's the kind of example that is not going to be an easy solve as well, and they may be the ones you've got to have a bit more of a thinking conversation about. Okay, let's have a look. There's a question about Victoria Walks have come up with a document about urban speed limits and encouraging more 10 or 20 kilometre pedestrian priority zones. And it's asking whether there's any evidence to point to this as crash data. We probably don't yet. One of the challenges with residential areas is that they often have relatively low volumes and low crashes on an individual basis, you know, street by street. And the only way you can really tackle it is if you're looking at large areas and saying, well, what's the overall crash rate on an area, and are we getting some changes? And we probably haven't done as much of those studies as we'd like to over time. It's been more on an individual street, much easier to do on the busier roads where there's a lot more crashes. So I don't have anything off the top of my head that I can refer to for that one. Yep, that's one I've got here too, actually. Okay, so I've got one road that's been identified on Megamaps as being the top 10% high risk road. Should I just focus on this road as low hanging fruit before looking at the rest of the district? It's low hanging fruit if it's an easy sell. If you look at the road and go, well, yeah, it should be the speed limit, the calculated safe and appropriate speed, then it's an easy win. It should be one that makes sense, and you've got the safety argument behind you as well. There may be other roads nearby that have a similar look to them, and you may want to think about, do I also do those? Because otherwise someone's going to ask the question. They say, well, why did you change that speed limit and not that speed limit as well? So that's where you may, as say, do that 10% plus as well. But some of them may be high risk, top 10%, and so from a safety perspective they warrant it, but they still look in some way or feel like a higher speed road. Those ones I wouldn't necessarily call low-hanging fruit in terms of they're going to take a bit more effort. You're going to perhaps have to think about what engineering measures you may have to also employ as well to make that happen. There's a fair chance if it's in that top 10%, it's got a fair bit of traffic volume and crashes that can help justify that. So it's probably an easy one to justify. I hope that helps there. Right, there's a question about regional state management plans. Will state highways be included? My understanding is it should capture all the road controlling authorities, including the state highway as well as the local authorities. I have seen draft proposals for it, and I guess we're kind of in the hands of the Ministry of Transport at the moment as to how quickly that will roll through. I think separately, Waka Kotahi is developing their own state highway speed management plan as well, I guess to try and have some consistency across the network. Okay, there's a question about the paper where I looked at the speed change from 80 to 100. So for those who haven't come across it yet, back in 1973, the open speed limit was dropped down to what was then 50 miles an hour, or 80 kilometres an hour. And that was partly due to the oil shocks at the time, and then was increased again back up to 100 k's an hour in 1985. And not surprisingly, perhaps, when we looked at the evidence, myself and Bill Frith, we found there was a big drop in rural fatals and serious injuries when it went down, and a big jump up when it went back up again as well. After that, there was a decline, and people often sort of look and think, well, hang on, what was the decline about? And the problem is that speed management is just one thing that's kicking in at any given time. There's a whole lot of other safety initiatives going on. And in the late 80s was a time when also they started introducing some other quite serious road safety measures as well. It was about the time they first started doing serious black spot treatments, for example, and saying, okay, we need to look at individual sites and work out what we can do to those, for example. So starting to get serious with those things started having an effect, starting to ramp up things like drink driving enforcement and other measures like that. So if you look over a long period of time, there's always a constant improvement in things. Things like vehicle standards, for example, have improved over the years. The car you drive now is so much better than 20 years ago or 40 years ago in terms of saving people's lives. The roads now, definitely a higher standard than 20 years ago, 40 years ago as well. So we're constantly improving those things a little bit as we go along. And so over time, you will see improvements like that, or you should. But then other things come in, like distractions from mobile phones in the last decade. So what we're looking for the speed management for that stuff is we were looking for fairly short-term changes, okay? And that's what happens when you change the speed limits. Very quickly you can see a change in behavior. And so for a short period of time, at least 1 or 2 years, you might be able to see what's going on from that. As you get beyond, certainly beyond 3 years, chances are other influences are going to start affecting those numbers again. And that's really what happened there, was that we saw that jump up in the mid to late 80s. That was about the time the country said, hang on, we're back up to 800 deaths here. This is not very good. And we've been chipping away at that ever since. And clearly a lot of good initiatives have helped with that. Problem is we're sort of running out of some of those initiatives, the low-hanging fruit, if you like, of safety. And this is where speed management is the one that we haven't done as much in that past. We were still basically living in a 100K, 50K world. And we're now starting to see this as another tool that could get us a little bit further down the line. Certainly what our overseas colleagues have found. Okay. Interesting comment about the greatest opposition to speed management changes seems to be the Automobile Association. Should a national local stance be made to AA? Well, that's beyond my pay grade, I'm afraid to say. But I think it's a fair comment that we've got to look at who we're having the conversation with, at least in terms of stakeholders. So, in fact, the legislation, the speed limits legislation, says it's a requirement to consult with the Automobile Association and the Road Transport Forum, the truckies, as part of any consultation, and then other affected stakeholders as well. But none else is specifically mentioned other than the police. So, for example, things like walking and cycling users, local residents, all of them will potentially have an impact or be impacted by a speed limit change as well. And we've got to make sure we're getting that range of views. And I think it depends a bit on what is the road that you're considering. So if you are talking about an arterial road where the aim is to get from A to B usually reasonably efficiently, then there is a fair argument for having a lot more weight, if you like, on the people who are focused on getting from A to B efficiently. If you're talking about, say, speed limits on a local street, where actually that's where people live and work and play, then I'm less concerned about people trying to shortcut through that street. And I'd be far more interested in the views from the residents and the people who walk and cycle and so forth in those areas. So I think that's one thing to look at in terms of consultations is working out the relative weight you want to place given the function of the road as to how much it is important to consider the efficiency argument versus the other amenity arguments that I alluded to earlier as well. Okay, and so sometimes that AA feedback is really important to understand, and other times it's not actually relevant for the particular road in question being looked at from there. Okay. But it's an interesting area, this whole stakeholder consultation, in terms of how do you get there. Part of it, I guess, is trying to preempt it as well by thinking what are going to be the concerns and the arguments, and really trying to make sure you do have all your ducks in a row beforehand. Before you go up for consultation, you have looked into the safety issues, the other arguments, the benefits that you can portray, the potential disbenefits and how they could be mitigated or maybe be overstated by some people as well. And so it's good to have that in place rather than putting it out there to your elected members, putting it out to the public and getting all these things back, all these concerns, and saying, well, hang on, we've already got an answer for that. Well, that's where you needed to do your homework early on. Okay, we're just about coming up to 12 o'clock here. I think we've captured all the questions that have come through. There were some really good questions there, an interesting range of things, and it just shows you that this is a complex area. There's technical issues, but there's also, if you like, political issues as well in terms of making these things happen. We appreciate that. But we should be able to come up with some solutions that mean over time we're going to have a much safer environment around the country as we start seeing more and more of these, particularly lower speeds introduced, or certainly more consistent, coherent speed limits for the right place as well. Okay, so I really thank you all for your attention here and engagement as well. Some great questions. If you want to contact me further, I think my email address was there on the last slide, but it's just glen@viastrada.nz, or you can have a look on our online platforms, and it's pretty easy to find me or any of our people there on our website and our various social media pages as well, LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter as well. And I certainly look forward to hopefully having a conversation with some of you a bit more about some of the speed management problems that you've got in your areas as well. Always very happy to help with those as well. So thank you once again for your participation today, and hopefully we'll do it again sometime as well. Thanks a lot.